Let's start our second session with Joel Simon, who is an artist, researcher, and toolmaker inspired by the systems of biology and creativity. It is a great pleasure to have Joel here, and many of us have seen some of his work during this uh, course, and of course, outside of this course. So please go ahead and tell us about your work. Thank you.
Sure, yes, thank you. Let me share my screen real quick. It's an honor to be here today. Thanks for having me. It's also an honor to be going after Jeff, who is one of the researchers who's inspired my work, which I'll get to. So today, the talk is creative networks. And what I mean by that is I'll be talking about my work, my artwork, the tools I make, how I think about creativity in relation to the topic of the class. And I'll be doing all of this in the context of forces, networks, and emergence, which are kind of both the medium and the subject of a lot of my work. And so through this talk, I'll try to kind of explain what I mean by that and how I think about that. But before I even get to that, I want to talk about things that have inspired me. Inspiration is a big theme of this talk. And so when I was in college, something that was inspiring to me, well, we'll talk about two inspirations at first. So the first thing was in college, I read this book called Creativity by the author of Flow. And in it, he asked a kind of simple question, which was, why was it that certain places were so creative? You can think of Florence in the Renaissance, or Paris at the end of the 19th century, or New York at the end of the 20th century. What made these places so creative? Was there something in the water they were all drinking? Were they genetically different then? Of course not. But if you think about creativity from a systems perspective, you can, in kind of an empirical way, things that can be quantified, you can look at creativity as something that emerges out of the confluence of commerce, of trade, of patronage, of the flow of ideas, of trade, even architecture, the ability for people to serendipitously run into one another, and you can kind of begin to have a systems perspective on what it means to be creative. And so, in his essay or paper on kind of a systems perspective for the study of creativity. And at the time, I was studying a combined degree in computer science and fine art. And so this was very appealing to me, this kind of thinking about my own creative process in this kind of systems perspective. And Brian Eno also has a really good quote about this, kind of a critique on this kind of concept of the lone genius. And he has this term, scenus, which is kind of like the genius of a scene. And, a lot of, people we think of as geniuses came from a kind of milieu of people, of ideas. And, would people in the Renaissance have been as famous if they were born 50 years earlier? Well, maybe not. They were kind of the right people, but they're also in the right place at the right time. And we can begin to think of creativity as this kind of emergent product of all these forces working together to create these hotspots. And so that was very inspiring for how I started thinking about my work. And there's one other thing that inspired me, but it was more of a realization than an inspiration, almost a sad realization, which was that I wanted to be a sculptor. I wanted to be like Rodin, but I realized I couldn't do this. Maybe if I'd practiced a lot, I could get pretty good, but I would never really get as good as Rodin. But also Rodin had already happened, right? That was 100 years ago. The world has moved on. That kind of sculpture has passed. It was in the digital era, and I had to recognize that, I had to get over that. And I tried doing digital sculpture. I interned for a sculptor 1 year doing kind of digital sculpture, what I thought it meant to do sculpture in the modern era. And I learned tools like ZBrush and Maya, right? And you hear these horrible interfaces filled with complexity. They give me hives looking at them now. But something felt off. Not only was it not enjoyable, or it was conceptually something was wrong, in that I realized these are digital attempts to mimic something analog, but they weren't truly computational. It wasn't sculpting in the medium of the computer. It was this kind of digital but not computational. And more or less all of my work, I think, in a little bit since then, back in college, has been trying to think through what does it mean to create in a computational way. and not just in kind of a digital way that mimics something from the real world. So those are some of the inspirations. And going forward, actually, everything in this talk is structured around work and its inspiration and experiment. Because I think a lot of my work is getting inspired by something and doing an experiment around it, as I've kind of reflected upon my work for this talk. And so everything in this talk is kind of inspiration and experiment, in and out. And so later on in college, I found this thing called topology optimization, which blew my mind. And here are some examples. This is Joris Larman's bone chair on the left. And this is on the right, an output from an Autodesk package. It's a truss kind of support. And when I saw this, I thought, wow, this is computational design. These are new forms that a human could never have produced or thought of, in this kind of optimality to them. And so topology optimization is kind of at its core, a simple method where you kind of iterate, like the way a tree will add forces depending on where the wind is pushing it. You subtract where it's redundant and you add where it's weak. And you iterate and you kind of sculpt these very biological forms. And I saw these, and these were deeply inspirational to me. And Joris Larman, by the way, did this a long time ago. But something again felt off. And thinking about it, in real nature, we have this notion of plasticity, right? A tree, what it means to be optimal is that it's kind of this perfect pairing for its environment. It's been shaped by its environment. All the wind, all the light, it is a product of its environment. It has this adaptivity to it. And so one of the first experiments I did in this line of thinking was trying to apply this to generative architecture and thinking about what would it mean to optimize a building in its environment, kind of grow it in its environment the way a tree grows where it is. Could you grow a building? And this is also very related to something I'll touch on in a bit that Jeff talked about, which is this idea of kind of encoding methods and increasing the complexity of what can be optimized. Because of course, we don't have a gene encoding every single cell. We have these higher level properties that give rise, we have 20,000 or so genes and we have trillions of cells. So I did this project where I took a floor plan. This is a school I just found online, and I said, okay, let's optimize it. Let's try to minimize the amount of materials that are used and minimize the amount of walking time and stuff like that. And what came out was this, something pretty crazy. And as you can tell, peak building, the pinnacle of architecture right here. It's been solved. So I wasn't trying to make a real building that would be built, of course. And in some sense, my naivete about architecture, if I had studied architecture, I don't think I would have been able to make this. It kind of came from just throwing out all the rules, and it was kind of trying to be a little provocative and like, well, what if we really used optimization as kind of the medium here, and we grow this floor plan. And I did so in a way where, to get this kind of emergent property, I modified the neat algorithm, so I worked on graphs, and so it's a forced layout, and all the optimization is occurring on these higher level simulation parameters, the physics of the graph layout was being tweaked, and an ant colony algorithm was being used to grow the hallways. So you optimize the meta parameters of the ant colony algorithm, and you can hear go away with windows, and of course it added courtyards. So this is kind of a little bit, in some ways, kind of critiquing generative design, where it's well, it'll do what you optimize for, but at the same time, it was also kind of saying, well, if you are open to what this kind of optimization can tell you, you might find new interesting ways that might provoke you a little bit. And this was definitely kind of a little bit of a provocation. And it was a controversial project online, which was fun. Some people really loved it. Some people did not in the architecture world. A lot of comments like, you couldn't build this, yada, yada. And here's kind of just a video of how it might grow, a little floor plan. So that was a fun early project. And then another thing I was kind of doing at the same time was I was very inspired by, this is Carl Sims' Evolving Virtual Creatures from, I think, 93. And I was really, again, going back to this idea of emergence and growth and optimization. I was kind of curious, why hadn't the complexity of things scaled up? And so I got very inspired again by kind of this idea of embryogenesis or growth and the use of pattern formation and morphogens in the growth process. And related to that is reaction diffusion, which you're probably familiar with. This is from Carlson's website as well. These kinds of patterns with, in this, this instance of it, these kind of different partial differential equations, and you can get these beautiful patterns that emerge, and they're used a lot in art for kind of texture. And then another thing that I was very into at the time, this is actually from one of Jeff's papers in indirect encoding. So this is a diagram of CPPNs, which he explained, which is a way to kind of, from a simple net that maps from position to color, and then you do that across a pixel space, you can convert, the weights of the network into an image, and so you can produce simple images. And I was really thinking about ways to, again, take these ideas of growth to produce emergence, produce more sophisticated forms. And the floor plans were 2D, so I wanted to try something in 3 dimensions for this next project. And so I did this project called Evolving Alien Corals. And here's just a little video of some of them growing. And so what I did here basically is it's a 3D mesh. And rather than enumerating the CPPN across an image, I did it here across the vertices of the mesh. And each time step, so it's iterative, it's not just once, it's every time step for a growth during a simulation. It will control, instead of the color of a pixel, it will control how much of this vertice move in its kind of normal direction forward, and as well as emit morphogens. And if you do that iteratively, the same way a cell doesn't just output itself once, it does it iteratively, it is compounding effect that allows kind of a greater emergence. These kind of incredible forms could grow, but you had a light simulation, you had a fluid simulation. And so the forces at play there are basically those 2 things. And here's, I'll try to go to the next slide. Whereas the video I did with my friend and collaborator, Nick Symbios, where we kind of did a higher res render. And if you go online, there's some, I've muted it here, but there's some very fun audio that goes with it. And so the colors here, I think it's important to note, a lot of reaction diffusion was kind of just like this nice, pretty pattern. But what's going on here is these colors of these corals are actually, those are the morphogens that are being used in a functional manner to drive the growth form, and it needed them. And so the colors, so this is like, to my knowledge, the first time where these morphogens aren't just being generated to produce patterns, but they're actually being, the parameters of the morphogens are being optimized, which gives rise to the form. And I thought that was just incredibly cool. And I really haven't done a good job of communicating this, I think, but like in the early phases of these, like the coral, where it's just a sphere, it goes through these multiple phases of different morphogen patternings, which give it the capacity to, for instance, like change different phases during the growth process. And so that was just very cool to me. And so you could also do things like if you vary the amount of light or the depth gradient, it would kind of drive different forms. And so I started getting interested in this idea of almost being able to sculpt with forces or sculpt with objectives, and thinking about driving forms, not sculpting it by hand, of course, but being able to use the forces as the way of driving the form, or I like to say form follows fitness function. And another project, so those are all about individual morphologies. Another thing, in this case, it was an idea that inspired a project, was this, again, things don't evolve just in isolation. It's all about environments and this complex ecosystems. And so kind of another kind of adjacent thing to those prior two was this idea of thinking about the ecosystems. There's this idea or this concept called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, where if you have too much disturbance in the ecosystem, everything will die. But if you have no disturbance, you might reach a kind of boring equilibrium with not that much diversity. But in the middle, there's like the amount of disturbance that leads to optimal diversity. And I think I'm also interested in algorithms that I think have parallels to humans. And so a lot of artists, I think that's kind of interesting, maybe the parallels to the internal disturbances that, maybe a lot of artists experience. And there's definitely a healthy amount in the middle. So I did a very simple plant ecosystem where each, it might be hard to see, but each sphere is an individual, each color is a different species. And in the bottom, you can kind of plot the different populations over time. If you're familiar with NetLogo, it's similar to that. And so what was interesting to me here is, again, thinking of kind of new, like maybe metaphors for interacting with it. Is like, this is an ecosystem. What if I tried to sculpt this pattern, but instead of just controlling it, I would cause disturbances, for instance, or cause invasive species, or merge different islands together. And I would in effect kind of paint via the interface of ecological events. Or what would it look like to see ecological collapse? Or is there a beauty just to a certain amount of biodiversity? I didn't place these circles, but because there's something that emerges, like almost kind of like a biophilia hypothesis, where this idea we're attracted to life. But abstractly, are we attracted to equilibrium? Are we attracted to balanced biodiversity? Are we attracted to optimized forms for multiple objectives? What layer of abstraction does that biophilia operate? Is something that's been kind of interesting or motivating to me in my work. Okay, next. And so in some of my projects, I'm inspired by a single image. And so like I'll just be reading something, I'll see an image, and I'll be like, aha, the project, and I'll drop everything. And so this happened once I was reading about like early societies and reading about cuneiform, and related to kind of the earlier projects. A lot of it's about like what are the forces that will give rise to this form, in the corals, for instance, or the floor plans. It's thinking about the relationship of the emergence of form driven by the forces acting upon it. And so I started thinking about cuneiform. I got very interested, or I got inspired with the idea of calligraphy as another emergent solution to a multi-objective problem, right? With the calligraphy, maybe you don't see it here, but you can, this is cuneiform, but what you're trying to do is create a set of forms that are all recognizable, mutually distinctive, and maybe have like minimum amount of effort to write. And so given those like kind of three objectives, you can think of every calligraphy system as a different solution set to that, which is really beautiful. So I did this experiment where I created kind of a custom neural architecture. It's kind of an inverse autoencoder, where these two networks have to learn to communicate a very simple binary language through a noisy medium. And so they had to create a visual image that would be robust to noise for communicating it. And they had to all be mutually distinctive. And here are 6 different languages, or characters really more than languages, that were totally emergent from this process. So there's no training data in this process. It's just every time you ran it, you get a different set of kind of distinct patterns. Each one has a cohesion within it, but again, each, so for example, like the top left, that's 25 of the characters in the first language. And I thought this was really kind of visually compelling, but also speaking to this idea of optimization. So I really like these characters a lot, kind of totally just wild computational patterns. And then that got inspired idea of like language games, and how in human language, it's not just trying to satisfy. When we communicate, there's a cooperative, we're trying to communicate information, but it's also a bit adversarial, right? We're playing these different mental games with one another. And so I modified the neural architecture to be both cooperative and adversarial. This project called Dimensions of Dialogue, where trying to think also through like how could the loss function of the neural artwork be actual part of the artwork. And so it was a combined adversarial loss, like a GAN, where there was a reference data set, and this cooperative loss. So these two networks were kind of working together and fighting. And that produced kind of new calligraphy sets that still resembled existing data sets. But they weren't just like visually similar. Each one was also like mutually distinctive in kind of this functional way. And then I CNC'd that into clay tablets and fired it. And then paired this kind of alien-like languages together for that project. Okay, so another project that was literally inspired by one image was this self-portrait of Matisse on the left. And what's interesting about this grid of self-portraits by Matisse is that none of them really share any attributes in common. And this was his goal for this project, where if you look at them, all of the noses are different, the glasses are all different shapes, the hair is all different shapes between them. They're all mutually dissimilar in any one attribute you look at, but yet they all look like Matisse. They all have this kind of gestalt to them. And you know, it's a fascinating drawing exercise. I guess now that I put it here, it's somewhat interesting paired with the languages, the idea like kind of mutual dissimilarity. Yeah, so how is that possible? And what does that mean about kind of identity in faces? So I was inspired by that, and I did some kind of generative drawing projects. So on the right, these are portraits that are created with genetic algorithms, kind of just optimizing lines and curves. And I was trying to go for some of the same idea. Could you, with like almost like a face identity loss, but then like a mutual dissimilarity loss. And that part actually hasn't been finished yet. I kind of ran into some other things along the way. So here I was generating faces with genetic algorithms, but it was inspired by that. And I really kind of enjoyed how they came out using just like the OpenCV classifier. And then that evolved into another project, which is again inspired, but a little different, with my collaborator, Tal Shiri, where we did a kind of machine learning project. This was in the NeurIPS art gallery this year, where we took the OpenCV convolutional face detector, and we created a system where we created a patch scan, which we would pick out different patches from images, and then it would optimize. It was basically a collage generator where it would be like, all right, what is the patch to cut out, and then where do I place it? So it's kind of doing feature inversion, and then optimizing for kind of recognizing a face, and it would be optimizing directly gradient descent on the patch latent vectors and their position and rotation to generate faces, which was kind of interesting experiment and think about ways machine learning could be used. And definitely going forward, I think the control over this is something that I'm interested in pursuing. So another project, again inspired by, just in this case it was an image, it was an idea, it was and thinking about generativity. Was The Game of Life by Conway, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and This Concept of Life by the architect Christopher Alexander, which is hard to explain, but it's basically this idea of when you have this kind of proper fit between people and their environment that satisfies kind of their problems, you get this kind of thriving of life. And with my generative floor plans, we have this problem, of course, where like you can't really quantify what a good floor plan is, and that's kind of the main fallacy of a lot of generative architecture. And there's a lot of objectives. There's a long tail of objective and subjective ones. But here with life, you basically just have one objective: optimize life. So I put these two together, and I said, well, what does it mean to create a generative architecture for artificial life? I can't be a real architect, but maybe I can be an architect for virtual life. And so what I did is I trained I did like a whole bunch of different optimization methods. So here's some of the optimized ones that are, the compression here is not so great, but basically it was optimizing the amount of life, where it's that's the yellow, given a certain amount of area, which is kind of the green patches. So you can imagine this is like a generative forms to optimize life. And what do they look like? And for this, I trained a GAN on layered Perlin noise, and then I did like the CME evolutionary strategy on that. Well, actually, I also did map elites, and I did multi-objective NSA G2. I did a bunch of stuff on that, including map elites. So that was a fun kind of totally random project, thinking about optimization and form. All right. Okay, so now this is something that overlaps with Jeff's talk, and something that was very inspirational for me. which is already mentioned a little bit, but this is PickBreeder on the left. So this was a project done by Kenneth Stanley, Jimmy Checkerton, and some others, where it was using a CPPN, which is that network for producing images, and it was an online interactive tool for discovering and kind of mutating images. And there's a corresponding book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, which I also found very inspiring. This this idea that you can't always great things happen kind of by these stepping stones of things that are interesting, and there's no way really to know what stepping stone will get there. As Jeff spoke about, that a vacuum tube would lead to a computer. You could never have known that. And the images that were produced on the site were pretty great. And I was also very inspired by the idea of like interactive evolutionary algorithms, the idea that humans in the loop help the algorithms, because we have this kind of innate idea of what is interesting that has property to us, this kind of intuitive sense of what has potential. And so I was a big fan of that project. And then in 2018, GANs were hot. They're still hot. Everyone's talking about Big GAN, which is incredible GAN by Andy Brock at Google. And Big GAN produces like these incredibly high quality images. And at the time, I actually was really into it because I was working on the genetic algorithms and this idea of these indirect or emergent mappings between genotype and phenotype. But one of the big problems with those, like with the corals, if you were to, or the floor plans where you have this kind of lower dimensionality genotype, and you can think of it kind of as a decoding process or a decompression process, between genotype and phenotype. And so that's a good property to have, but you also want the property where if you were to mate genomes, the phenotype child that would result should resemble both parents, right? If you have a kid, it should look like the parents for evolution to work. And a lot of genotypes didn't have that property. Even, they were emergent, but they couldn't do that. But when I came across scans, these latent vectors have that property. And so I came at it from a purely genetic algorithm background. Oh, you can now do, you can now actually do crossover. And that was really cool to me. And so, I saw Big GAN, I saw PickBreeder, and at the time, I there's different types of creativity that are discussed or out there. There's like iterative creativity where you improve something slightly. There's combinatorial creativity where you're like, these two things, what if you put these two together? And there's like transformative creativity where it's like, relativity or some new genre. This was definitely a combinatorial thing where I was like, hey, like someone needs to put PickBreeder and Big GAN together. Like, why hasn't anyone done this yet? Like, this just seems kind of obvious. And I just figured someone else would do it, but they didn't. So it didn't feel like some kind of like, it was no big innovation. It was just like, well, someone's got to do this. I guess I have to do it. It was like an obligation. So I created this website called GANBreeder at the time, named after PickBreeder. And as Jeff mentioned, Endless Forms was a site for doing it in 3D as well. And so, so GANBreeder came out. It was basically PickBreeder with Big GAN, where it was an interactive online latent space explorer tool. So these images on the right are outputs from Big GAN that were made in ArtBreeder. So, you can kind of compare them to the ones on the bottom left, where you have like individual classes that look really good. You have bubble, you have mushroom, but it turns out, there's all these other wonderful, wild, and weird images that exist kind of in the in-between spaces between all those other classes that were discovered through GANBreeder. So GANBreeder is kind of what I'm known for now, and so I'll talk about it a little bit, how it works. So it's an online site. It was called GANBreeder. It got renamed to ArtBreeder. I wanted to keep it accessible, multi-user, latent space, high dimensional latent space explorer, .com would have, wouldn't really have the same ring to it. And yeah, a lot of people don't know what that means. So I wanted to keep it accessible. And so it's basically, there's kind of just 3 simple ways of making images. You can, for any image, you can get random children, which is like random noise added to the latent vector. You can mix any 2 images together, which is just averaging their latent vectors. And then you can edit the genes of an image, which is, so big GAN is a conditional GAN. So there's a latent vector and a class vector. And so the way I think about these is there's biological and creative process parallels. And what I mean by that is, a lot of creativity is exploratory, but then there's kind of phases of that exploration where maybe in the beginning, you don't know exactly what you want. You're kind of most open-ended. Just show me something cool and I'll see what I like. And that's kind of the leftmost mutation. And then maybe during the process, you're narrowing it a little bit. Well, I want, in terms of intentionality, I should say, a gradient of intentionality where the left is least intentional. You just show me some cool stuff. I'll see what I like. The middle is kind of in the middle for intentionality. I like these two things. I wonder what they look like together. And the third one is kind of most intentional. I'm very close to what I want, but just I want to tweak it very slightly and see what that looks like. But there's also these biological parallels where, I refer to the leftmost is kind of like asexual reproduction, the middle is sexual reproduction, and the right is, I guess, CRISPR for, directly tweaking the genes. And these are kind of the different ways you can create and make images. And so, for example, here's an image that I made, and here are the genes that make it up, right? There's a little bit of the Alps, some tray, a mask, some killer whale. There's even pineapple in there. No one would have ever thought to put these together. There's 1,000 different classes. No one would have ever conceived of this. There was really no other way to have made this image except for this kind of interactive exploration collaborative process. Because again, humans, we can't think in 1,128 dimensions. We just don't have that power. And you can also, a cool thing or something that I really enjoy with art breeders, you can see all these evolutionary trees and who made the image, what images got mixed together, kind of see the roots of how an image was made. And also it's kind of like the history of this whole remix. Those are fun to browse. And sometimes you go back really far and involve, an image could have hundreds, if not thousands of descendants with many different people involved in the creation process. And it's all social. So, there's a trending page where you can browse all the images, and this allows, good things to be brought up for everyone else. And so as they discussed in the PickBreeder paper and why greatness cannot be planned, collaborative creativity is not, it doesn't just mean, there's different ways of doing collaboration where, like the example they use is, if everyone voted, for instance, kind of like a Twitch plays art making, you would kind of get this regression to the mean, you get this average, right? You don't want all your favorite musicians to have to like vote on, or like, you don't want the average song that they make, right? You're going to get something bad. But what you want is the ability to allow individuals to, pursue their own unique sense of what's interesting, follow it, and then once they reach something cool, share it back in the larger population, right? Just like any other part of culture. And that's what allows this kind of collaborative or remixed ecosystem to form. People are they're able to be inspired by things, use them as starting points, and continue the process. So I do think of art breeder, it's not, you're not really necessarily making art. The art is a bit flawed there, in that it's almost more like a inspiration tool or a tool for before you have the idea, where musicians, they might do album covers, so when I get in that sense, like it's people who couldn't make kind of high fidelity images before can now do so. So a lot of, like I hear from writers who can now visualize the characters of their books. They couldn't draw all these kinds of faces before, but they can kind of create something like, or musicians who can create covers for their albums on SoundCloud, but also professional artists as well who can make these images. They use it just to help find ideas and then take things to kind of paint over later. So I think that's a nice property that if you make it just really simple, it'll be used by amateurs and professionals. At least find their own use cases for it, which I think is really cool. And here's a more recent feature that's, more complicated, but for those interested in machine learning, I think it's relevant. There's been a lot of work in latent space detangling in these GANs, where basically, you want to find some direction in latent space that means something. and often they're entangled, right? If you add make it older, maybe it makes it more male as well. And so recently, I released the ability to create your own genes. So it's a little more complicated, but what's cool is that this really, takes advantage of all the benefits of this kind of crowdsourced ecosystem where, because people have tagged all the images, you can then use those tags and be like, all right, here's 20 beard people. And then you can kind of tweak it. You can subtract maybe age or gender. You can create your own beard gene, which is nice. You can also do things that are more subtle. Maybe there's some subtle property that you appreciate. Maybe there's not even a word for it, but if you can just recognize it and you can collect samples of it, you can then turn it into basically a tool or a filter for that, which I think is a powerful thing, because a lot of people, they know what they like when they see it. And the first version of PickBreeder was much simpler. It was just a grid of images with the prompt, which image is most interesting, and that was it. Because I was interested in almost this theoretical limit of simplicity. To go back to that kind of early interfaces where, there's nothing simpler than here are a few options, pick the one you like best. You can't get simpler than that. People have good intuitions. And actually, so in some cases, I also I heard some examples made from people, which is the most inspiring part of it. People paint over it, to go back to the idea, it's kind of inspiration fuel. So I really enjoy people characters where they saw the idea in this kind of GAN blob, and it was just enough to provoke an idea in them, and then they could then finish off and paint. So the bottom left is a concept artist who kind of drew bodies around the faces. The bottom center was an unexpected use case where now you can upload photos. And it will embed it in the latent space. People have been using that to colorize historical figures or paintings, see what they would look like real. And that was not something I really planned for, but that's been something that's gone viral a lot. Philosophy magazine, someone made a dress, a lot of stuff like that. And that's all very inspiring and motivating to see. People who didn't think of themselves as artists, now can feel creative and make things. So that's very cool. And another point on this was so in some sense I think of PickBreeder as it's kind of like the GAN showing off the interface, but also the interface showing off the GAN. For me, the experiment was actually the interface, not so the GAN. And so people come to it kind of see it different ways. But in some sense, I think the interface wouldn't have worked without Big GAN. And, but the interface also showed off all the things Big GAN was possible, what it could do, and all the potential it had. So it's really a very mutually beneficial system. But I don't think, it could have worked without the interface or without Big GAN originally. The two really had to go together.
Joel, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I love everything you're showing so far, including the corals. Here I have a question. Can you just say really quickly a little bit about how you did the thing where it recognizes the dimension in the latent vector that's shared amongst all the images so that you can create a new gene?
Oh, absolutely. I meant to say that. It's very simple, actually. So in this case, if you collect a bunch of images, in this case, it's beards, all it's doing is it's averaging them and then subtracting the mean from that to give you a direction to that space. And that's it. And that works pretty well. But what you can do is you can then, you can control things. So in this case, style GAN specifically is content versus style. So if you're doing hair color, you can be all right, I found a bunch of people with pink hair, but only control or only affect the fine style layers. Or maybe because of the biases of the model, everyone with pink hair was also female. So you can just manually be all right, change the gender gene from that gene. And so you get this kind of compound effect because there's this database of genes out there and database of tags that everyone's doing together. It allows you to make these better genes. But it's just the mean of the images. So the more images, the better.
Two quick comments. One is, I wonder if it would work better if you had pairs of this has this feature, this doesn't. You pairwise subtract them. This one's close to that one, but it doesn't have the thing. and then you look for the average delta between those two. The mean will get you there too. So they're kind of interestingly both options. And the second is just to say that that's a really, really powerful idea you've come up with. I think that like on most recommendation engines, there's probably latent dimensions of variation that I care about that the recommendation engine does not know that I care about. And if like Spotify could help me like create a tool that says these two songs are similar, but one has the thing I want and one doesn't. You know, like for example, for me, it's like I really want them to key on whether there are words present in the song. Because when I work, I can't have lyrics. But that is just not something they ever key on in their recommendation engine. So they never figure it out. If I could help them figure it out via tool, and then they could like weave that back in, that would apply across e-commerce and any recommendation system. That could be a really powerful general tool that, you know, some company could sell to these things, or just to publish that they all incorporate and make all of our recommendations better. So nice work thinking of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree. I actually, the first draft had negative images, but but I found it was a little harder to explain to users. And for the majority of use cases, like pink hair, for instance, you just want people with pink hair and everyone else without pink hair. But there are a few cases where you do want the negative, I agree, but I found it complicated to interface. So I've been kind of debating adding that back in or not, but I think for some cases, absolutely, it could be helpful. Yeah, recommendations too, definitely. That's interesting. Okay, and so one thing about PickBreeder, just to before we get to the next slide, is I think that one thing to mention is the idea of ownership. Has been kind of a question, like, can I use these images professionally? Who owns the images, right? What's the difference between creating an image and discovering an image? Are those two different things? You know, is it a game, is it a tool, etc. And so, like 2 years ago, kind of inspired by this, I threw a party. It was called PickBreeder. It was called the GAN party. I was talking to that in LandBreeder. I couldn't tell with GAN party. We also call it LandBreeder, where basically I had a bunch of people in this house, and I made this, like, you know, like any good party, there was a real-time web app where we could all you know, operate on together. That's this top image here. And what it was is interactive popular. So I was into this idea of like, what does it mean to own something collectively? So in PickBreeder, each person's name is attached to the image. I mean, debatable whether or not you own it, how much you need to own it. But I was curious, like, how could you produce something that we all felt like we owned? And so I had the screen, and there's this website where there's a population of images currently, and everyone who was there at the party, you could click on an image you like to give it a kind of a score, and you could also take images from your Artbreeder pool to kind of throw in like invasive species. And what happens every time, you know, every few minutes, the generation would turn over. It's kind of like interactive evolutionary algorithm where our liking is a fitness function. So we were kind of shaping this population over time during this event. And it was fun to people be like, all right, you know, they'd all agree, let's throw some more like dogs or cats in there. And it would kind of be guiding collectively this population in real time. And in that sense, you know, no one owned the pool individually because, you know, we're all throwing in invasive species, we're all kind of shaping and guiding it in this collective behavior. And so I was curious in that. And so just to push that a little farther, you know, we all signed the output and we all like submitted it to some, you know, art thing with like, you know, I interested in the idea, like, you know, in science, you have these papers with like thousands of co-authors, but in art, you also have these kinds of like very, you know, deep stacks of tech that's being used. And, you know, it's clear that, you know, in science, you didn't invent every tool that you're working with, you cite them. And in art, you know, we still have this culture of individual genius, but you know, there's a system at play, there's a lot of collaborators, there's a lot of parts. And so I wanted to kind of do something similar where I had like, I don't remember if it was like 50 people who could collaborate online and in person. So there's something like 50 people who all signed this thing together, and we all kind of submitted it to an art show together. So that was just a fun little experiment. And on the bottom right, I did this interview project where I interviewed a bunch of art users and kind of generated this graph of images out of them for the interview. So I think that these ideas, it's going back to these ideas of kind of these ecosystems of collaboration. So it kind of concluding a little bit, I think that in thinking about like the future of creative tools, or like why computers and creativity anyway, right? Why bother? And so I think there's like, it makes sense to go back to like, what are our limitations? So humans are very creative, we're incredibly creative. In a lot of my work, I try to stay, human focused in that regard. And so starting kind of thinking about it, it makes us start off from the core limitations we do have, even though we're these incredible creative beings. And I think one is technical skill, where some people, the ability to lower the barrier between concept and execution is a very enabling thing. So I think that's a worthwhile area for computers. The second one I want to talk about is cognitive ability. I don't mean anyone in particular, I mean everyone. Like there's certain limitations to what we can understand, where no human can think in 1,000 dimensions. No matter how smart you are, you can't do it. You can't have the intuitions or the capacity there. We just don't have that. We just don't have that power. And there's some interesting research done by Christopher Alexander, where it's not just kind of like the quantitative amount, but the qualitative, how we think has real biases to it. And so we did this experiment where we show people patterns, the top left image there, represented by kind of the graph below, with these overlapping parts. And in this experiment, he said, here's a pattern, you show it to them briefly, and then ask them to draw it again. And they would all redraw it with a similar type of error, which is that they would not have the subparts overlap. They were kind of distinct hierarchies. And this was a lot of kind of how humans think. We have these very clear hierarchies, and in terms of like architecture, think about a lot of modern planning. This is residential, this is commercial, this is this side, that is that side. Within that are the sub areas, but we don't think about these complex overlaps that happen. And in some sense, that is the bias to our thinking. Group, subgroup of that group, subgroup of that group. But a lot of things in nature, if you look at a natural city, an organic city, every spot in that city is in some sense its own neighborhood. You can think of its own kind of sphere around it in terms of the things you might want or need. But we just, and you see this come up in kind of planned cities where it doesn't have those properties. Planned cities is like, all right, here's the highway, here's where people are, here's where cars are, and everything's divided in subdivisions. So there's different ways that humans are not capable of thinking. And lastly, I think is, we have routines, right? The better you get at something, more routines you have. We have biases to our randomness. And so I think these are the kind of some of the different areas where like, it is worth starting from when thinking about like, what are the ways we can actually use computers, I don't really think of machine learning as like that separate in this sense from all the other kind of generative technologies, but how can you use kind of computation in the creative process? And so, I think facilitating collaboration, facilitating exploration, allowing new mediums and metaphors, and allowing accessibility are really powerful ways. And it's something the internet has done this, overall. This idea of like YouTube has created a new medium of video bloggers. TikTok has created new mediums. But I think the ability to facilitate exploration, discovery, connect people with collaboration, people love getting new ideas, allow us, ways to get ourselves inspired. And I also kind of think about these in terms of like dialogue, where like you can almost think of it as like a creative director interacting with someone. Which of these do you like? It might be an interaction that would happen. Or, well, what if you did this? And I see what you're going for here. Let me help you along. And so I can kind of connect these to ways that, a creative director, I think about it in terms of like creative director, where a creative director, they have their underlings and they're like, well, do more of this, do less of that. And you wouldn't say a creative director is less creative because they're not on the medium. There's trade-offs to not working with the medium directly, but they're not less creative. They're just working in a different layer of abstraction in the creative process, right? Like, I like where you're going here, but just do more of that. And that's very empowering, very creative. And, a lot of people know what they like when they see it. And so building workflows around that can be very, very powerful. People do have good intuitions for what they want, even if maybe they're not trained in how to articulate it. And so tools that can work with these kind of existing ways that people have been able to operate at higher levels of creativity. And so so the kind of the overall here is that I'm optimistic in terms of the future of computation and creativity. And you see these arguments online that sound absurd, and people are making it like, well, we're just going to have GPT-3 stream TV shows into us, and that'll be the end of artists and creatives and whatever, which I would disagree with. I don't think it's going to be like GPT-2 movie into our head, out recommendation engines, better prompt, and we'll just be like hooked on the perfect Netflix show all day. I do believe it's going to be kind of person-driven, using the tool to make new artwork we'll share with other people. I mean, I think that, and I don't want to get into like what a definition of creativity here, because that's challenging, but I think that saying that, you know, these gender technologies are going to replace artists, I think is a very narrow view of what it means to be creative. It doesn't take into account creative expression, right? The need to express ourselves, express our experiences, our desire to connect with others through these shared experiences. You know, that's so much of what it means to be creative, to try to want to experience others' creativity. And I think everyone does want to be creative. I think everyone has a need for it. I think it's an innate human need. And it's not a, you know, it's not a means to be optimized, but it's an end in itself, you know, this desire to feel creative, to express oneself. So that's why I'm really optimistic about the future of these tools, making this more accessible for everyone. And so kind of in conclusion, so before I get to the conclusion, I got ahead of myself. I have in my work, so I like to, given all this, I've kind of wrapped this around, and I like to ask this question to people. It's a little bit of a provocation, but what is the most, it's a typo, excuse the typo. What is the most complicated thing humans have ever designed? And another format of this is like, what is the greatest thing humans have ever designed? And we're not in person, so I won't directly ask you, but you can think to yourself what the answer to this might be. And, you know, sometimes I hear things like nuclear reactor, a space station, you know, and that all little fine answers. But what I like to say is somewhat provocatively, it's in fact dogs. You know, we designed dogs from wolves. We did it tens of thousands of years ago. We don't exactly know when, but it was kind of this incredible design process. And so I'm inspired by dogs and the design process behind dogs and what the properties of it were. Because, you know, trillions of cells, right? That's the complexity of a dog. And we made these like incredible creatures that, I mean, well, recently, you know, some have health issues, like pugs have gone a little too far. But historically, you know, we created incredible creatures that we've, you know, deep emotional companionship with. They protect us, they work for us, you know, they live in our family, like they do all these things for us. They allow, in some cases, society, you know, to operate the kind of jobs they can do, to guard dogs. It's pretty phenomenal. And they don't ask for much either, you know, like it's not a lot of energy efficiency. And this is kind of an incredible design process. And I think about the process itself, which is also pretty incredible. You know, it was decentralized. There was no design committee 20,000 years ago, you know, doing a spec on like, you know, what is the design spec. It was incredibly intuitive, right? There was no academy where you learned how to breed dogs. You just took the popular litter you liked the most, and then somehow dogs emerged through that process. And so it was collaborative as well, and everyone did it. And it was able to be localized. Different regions had dogs that were suited toward their specific needs. And you think about those different properties, those are phenomenal design properties in terms of, and also it allowed you to create something beyond human level cognitive ability, right? No one knew how dogs worked, but it's still a design process in that we don't understand all of physics, but we still build things with physics, right? And so I've kind of put this together in this framework I'm calling like morphogenic design, which is almost like biomimetic design, but for the process of breeding and thinking about breeding an emergent form and creating things collaboratively beyond our own cognitive ability. So that's why I've named, for instance, my company Morphogen. It's because like morphogens are the agent of this, yada, yada. And so I kind of think of this, like the way I summarize all of this is like, you need growth for emergence, you need emergence for optimization, and optimization can often lead to beauty. And another way of phrasing it is, it's a way of kind of rethinking the design process from like, I made this to like, we bred this. So I'll just briefly touch on that. It's kind of, I haven't written this up because I don't really have the confidence to write a manifesto. I don't know, manifestos sound pretentious, but maybe one day. And so kind of in conclusion, you know, I think we are kind of these cells in this larger creative connective tissue. And, you know, there's these morphogenic gradients of ideas and inspiration. And we're taking inspiration in, you know, kind of through our little membranes, and we're putting out other projects that inspire everyone else in these complex systems. And so, you know, for me, everything's been like inspiration in and kind of project out based off the things that are around me and that I've seen. And so you know, I've made my peace now that I'll never be the next Rodin. I'll never sculpt like Rodin, and you know, oh well. But I'm okay with that because I think the future might even be more interesting, where I won't sculpt Rodin, but I'll be able to sculpt things like maybe a 3D printed building or a city of 3D printed buildings, and I'll be able to do so using the functions and doing things that are beyond what I could have ever comprehended or understood. And I'll be able to do so collaboratively, maybe with people, maybe optimizing what is an ecosystem of buildings that are mutually harmonious together as a complex ecosystem, and where each one is optimized for, you know, light and wind, and it's adaptive to its environment. And I'll be able to, yeah, we'll be able to sculpt these through kind of new ways of new metaphors and new techniques. And so this is the future I'm very optimistic about. But of course, technology has its pros and cons as well. So yeah, that was the talk. Thank you, and you can feel free to follow me anywhere if you want to.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. Thanks for sharing your view and how you get inspired and create things. It is very inspiring. It was great. Are there questions from students or audience in general? I think that sharing with us that how you're positive and optimistic about this dialogue that we can create between machines and humans was very also inspiring and enlightening in a sense, because as you mentioned, there are sometimes you know, thoughts that, oh, what will happen? We don't want the computers to create art for us, and I don't think that is going to happen as long as we have this kind of dialogue between machine and us. And by the way, as you mentioned, the concept comes from human and not the machine. So those are very good examples that you mentioned here. Are there any thoughts or questions? I see that we went a little over time, and I thank both of you that you stayed with us until now. Also students are thanking you on the chat, both of you. So I think that probably we can conclude the session, but thanks again. It was very, very interesting for me, and I'm sure for all of us.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me. And if you do put up a YouTube link, please let me know.
Of course, we will. And I'm going to share the links and everything, the website. Excellent.
Okay, cool. Take care.
Bye.